Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Michael's victory in the custody battle, though appearing to be a fair and just outcome for him and his children, concealed a much more complex and shadowed story that few were aware of. The courtroom drama, which was meant to be about Michael and Willow's fight for their children, was in reality a well-crafted plot with Drew as the central figure, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. On the surface, Drew presented himself as a devoted ally of Willow, claiming to support her in her fight to keep her children. But beneath this facade, Drew was orchestrating a far more sinister plan. His true objective was not to help Willow or her children. In fact, he had no interest in them at all. Drew wanted to see Willow lose everything, especially her autonomy. He knew that if Michael won the custody battle, it would deeply hurt Willow, stripping her of the role of mother and reducing her to a person entirely dependent on Drew's whims. Drew's scheme was far more insidious than anyone realized. While Michael's triumph in court seemed to be a win for justice, it was, in fact, the culmination of Drew's long-term manipulations. Every move Drew made, from planting the right evidence to influencing key witnesses, was carefully calculated to ensure that Michael would gain the custody he sought without facing serious opposition from Willow. Drew was not a genuine father to his own children, nor did he show any genuine concern for their well-being. His focus was on the power and control that would come with Michael's loss. In Drew's mind, the children were simply pawns in a game that was about far more than their upbringing or care. He cared only about what this victory could provide him with: influence, control, and a share in the vast wealth and legacy of the Corinthos family. What Drew failed to account for was the resilience and strength of Willow once she learned the truth. She had trusted him, believed in his words, and let him into her life. But when the full scope of Drew's betrayal was revealed, it hit Willow like a freight train. She realized that the man she had been leaning on, the man she thought could offer her a safe harbor, had been playing her all along. Drew had used her, not just as a means to his own ends, but as a tool in a cruel game of manipulation. All the love and affection he had shown her were simply lies designed to make her compliant, to make her bend to his will. The shock of this revelation left Willow devastated, but it wasn't just the loss of her children's custody that hurt her. It was the deeper wound, the betrayal of someone she had once trusted completely. Drew wasn't just a man who had taken her children away from her, he was someone she had given her heart to, someone she had believed understood her, and someone she had thought she could rely on. The emotional cost was immense, and the trust she had placed in him now felt like a cruel joke. Willow found herself spiraling into a whirlwind of emotions. Not only had she lost her children to Michael, but she had also lost the man who, in her mind, had been the only one who truly understood her. There was a bitterness in her heart now, one that twisted with every thought of Drew and the lies he had spun. She had given him her love, her vulnerability, and he had taken it all, only to use it for his own gain. But what hurt the most was the realization that Drew's machinations were not only about taking her children or controlling her, but they were also part of a larger game to secure his own place within the powerful corridors of the Corinthos Empire. Drew was playing a dangerous game, using his relationship with Willow as leverage to gain control over things that mattered far more than the children. He had sought to weaken her emotionally, make her reliant on him, and in doing so, he had hoped to secure the riches and influence that came with being a part of the Corinthos family's legacy. Drew's victory, however, was short-lived. As the reality of his manipulations hit Willow, she found herself driven to take back control. She may have lost the legal battle, but she was far from defeated. Drew's actions had pushed her to a point where she realized she no longer had to rely on anyone to define her worth or her place in her children's lives. The sense of betrayal, while profound, became a catalyst for her to reclaim her strength. It was clear that the path forward would be difficult. Drew had set many traps for her, but Willow was no longer the woman who had walked blindly into his arms. The woman who stood now was determined, fierce, and unwilling to let anyone, especially Drew, dictate her fate any longer. The battle for her children may have been lost, but the war for her independence and emotional freedom had just begun. As for Drew, the reality of his manipulations was starting to dawn on him. The loss of control, the loss of the power he so desperately craved, was inevitable. Willow had awakened, and with her awakening came the realization that Drew had underestimated her strength. What he had sought to break, he had inadvertently made stronger. Now, with everything he had worked for crumbling around him, Drew was left to confront the consequences of his actions. No longer the puppet master, he was now the one trapped in the tangled web of his own lies. The story was far from over. The future of Willow, Drew, and Michael, along with the children, would continue to unfold in ways no one could predict. The pain of the past may have marked them, but it was also shaping their futures in ways that would change them all forever. However, this discovery was far from the end of the story. While Drew was focused on maintaining control and pulling the strings of the situation, he was blindsided by a revelation that would shatter his carefully laid plans. He discovered that he was pregnant. The news struck him like a thunderbolt, and for the first time in his life, he found himself in a position he could not control. The pregnancy was not only a physiological shock, it was a clear symbol of the internal chaos and emotional turmoil that Drew was now forced to confront. He had spent so long consumed by his obsession with power, manipulation, and control that he had never even considered the possibility of facing this kind of responsibility. The man who had controlled every aspect of his life and his relationships, who had thought he could bend everyone to his will, now found himself at the mercy of something he could neither understand nor manipulate, the emotional weight of impending fatherhood. Drew's entire world began to crumble as he faced the reality of the pregnancy. The walls he had so carefully built around himself, the facade of indifference and cold ambition, began to crack. He was a man who had never imagined he would be in a position where he was not in complete control of his circumstances. And now, in the face of this unplanned pregnancy, Drew realized that the very thing he had always taken for granted, his power over others, was something that could be taken from him. The pregnancy was not just an unexpected event, it was a mirror reflecting his deepest fears and insecurities. For the first time, Drew could not manipulate the situation to his advantage. He could not calculate his way out of it, nor could he escape the emotional responsibility that came with it. As Drew grappled with the profound implications of his discovery, Willow, in her own right, was facing a moment of transformation. Despite the intense pain of being betrayed by the man she had trusted, she found herself forced to confront a difficult truth about herself. Her journey, too, was not one of simple victimhood but one of self-discovery and growth. She realized that she was not merely a pawn in Drew's game, she was a mother, and her primary responsibility was to protect her children. The weight of that responsibility bore down on her like never before. The loss of custody, the betrayal by someone she had loved and trusted, was enough to shatter any person's sense of self. But Willow knew she could not afford to wallow in despair. She had children to care for, and they depended on her strength. Her realization about Drew was one thing, but Willow also recognized that she had to grow as a mother. What choices did she have now? How could she possibly protect her children from the manipulations and deceit that had been a part of their lives? The questions plagued her every waking moment. In the face of her personal heartbreak, she was forced to question every decision she had made in recent months. Was it right to trust Drew? Was it right to stay in a relationship with a man who clearly had no regard for her well-being, or that of her children? Willow found herself at a crossroads, one where the choices she made would determine not just her future, but the futures of those she loved most. The emotional turmoil she had been through had become not only a personal reckoning but a painful reminder of the deep scars that had been left on her soul. Her relationship with Drew was no longer one of partnership, of love, or even of shared goals. It had turned into a battlefield, where both of them were now fighting not just for power, but for their very survival. Drew, who had once been the man she leaned on, the man she trusted implicitly, was now the person she had to fight against. No longer a companion, Drew had become a formidable adversary in a deadly game of manipulation, deception, and emotional warfare. Their once shared dreams were now twisted into a dark and dangerous conflict over who would emerge victorious, who would control the fate of their children, and who would ultimately be left broken in the aftermath. For Willow, the The reality of motherhood, of being a protector and nurturer, was now at the forefront of her thoughts. She had to become a mother who could fight for her children, who could rise above the chaos and pain that had so deeply affected her. She had to reclaim her identity not just as a woman betrayed, but as a mother who would do whatever it took to shield her children from harm. Every decision she made now had lasting consequences, not just for herself, but for the lives of those she loved. The war between Willow and Drew, once masked by the appearance of a cooperative relationship, had become a brutal confrontation where trust had been shattered and the battle lines were drawn. This was no longer a fight for love or affection, but a fight for control, for survival, and for the future. As Drew grappled with the unexpected pregnancy and Willow confronted her role as a mother, both were caught in a spiral of emotions, guilt, and regret. The stakes were higher than ever, and neither of them could predict the cost of what they would have to sacrifice in order to win, or lose. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain. Neither Drew nor Willow would ever be the same again. After discovering he was pregnant, Drew could no longer maintain the cold, calculating persona that he had so carefully crafted over the years. The revelation shook him to his core, and for the first time in his life, he found himself ensnared in an internal battle he was unable to escape. His entire worldview had been built on control, manipulation, and power, and this unexpected twist of fate rendered all of his plans and machinations meaningless. What had once been a flawless strategy now felt fragile and tenuous. As Drew was forced to face the reality of his situation, he was no longer the man in charge, the puppet master pulling the strings of everyone around him. As the weight of the pregnancy settled over him, Drew was confronted with the haunting realization that he could no longer play the game he had been so skilled at. The control he had sought to impose on Willow, his children, and the people around him had now come back to haunt him in ways he had never anticipated. The pregnancy was not just a physiological fact, it was a mirror reflecting his deepest fears and insecurities, a stark reminder that there were forces beyond his grasp. Drew found himself standing on the precipice of a new reality, one where his well-established notions of power and dominance no longer applied. He could not manipulate this situation, nor could he avoid the consequences of his actions. What Drew now had to face was an existential question. Would he continue down the path of control and deceit, trying to claw his way to dominance, or would he finally realize that love, family, and genuine connection were the only things that truly mattered in life? This was a crossroads that would define the rest of his life. He had spent so many years seeking power, but now that he had it all, he had to confront whether it had ever truly fulfilled him. Was this ambition worth the destruction it had caused in his personal relationships, and would he ever be able to repair the damage he had done to the people he claimed to care about? Drew's introspection was not a simple process. It was a long and painful unraveling of his own identity. He had spent so much time building walls around his emotions, cutting himself off from vulnerability, that now, in the face of an unplanned pregnancy, he was forced to reckon with his own humanity. He had been so fixated on gaining control over every aspect of his life that he had never stopped to consider the emotional cost. Now, with the consequences of his actions laid bare before him, Drew found himself questioning everything: his motivations, his relationships, and the very foundation of his character. Could Drew change? Was there still a chance for him to let go of the need for control and embrace the idea of love and family? Or was he too far gone, too wrapped up in his own self-interest to see a different path? Drew was torn between his desire for power and the realization that his future might require him to sacrifice that very thing. It was a battle within himself, one that pitted his old self, selfish, manipulative, and power-hungry, against a new version of himself, one that could possibly seek redemption, if he was willing to confront his demons. For Willow, the fight was equally intense, though different in nature. She was no longer just fighting against Drew, but also battling her own fears and doubts. In the wake of the betrayal, she had to navigate the painful and complex task of protecting her children from Drew's influence. She had always believed that love and motherhood were the driving forces behind her actions, but now, she was forced to face the harsh reality that love alone was not enough to shield her children from the chaos Drew had created. She had to be strategic, cunning, and above all, resilient. Willow could not afford to let Drew continue his manipulations unchecked. She had to ensure that her children would be safe, both physically and emotionally, from the storm that was brewing. But as she fought to protect them, Willow also faced the brutal truth that no one would come out of this conflict unscathed. Every choice she made would come with consequences, and she could not predict the fallout of her decisions. Would she succeed in keeping her children safe, or would Drew find a way to turn them against her? The possibility that she could lose her children completely was a nightmare she was forced to confront daily. And beyond that, there was the crushing weight of guilt that followed her every move. Willow was now a woman at war, not just with Drew, but with herself. The guilt of trusting the wrong person, of putting her faith in someone who had so easily betrayed her, was something she could not easily shake off. At the same time, Willow understood that the battle for her children was not just about defeating Drew, it was about redefining who she was as a mother. She had to rise above the pain, above the betrayal, and take control of her future and that of her children. But in doing so, she also had to come to terms with the fact that some choices came with a price. If she wanted to protect her children, she might have to sacrifice her own happiness, her sense of security, and perhaps even her relationship with Michael. The emotional and psychological toll was immense, and it left her questioning whether it was worth it. For both Willow and Drew, the road ahead was fraught with challenges. The secrets they had kept, the lies they had told, and the manipulations they had carried out would eventually come to light, and when they did, the repercussions would be far-reaching. No one could predict the full scope of what would happen when the truth was finally exposed. Would Drew finally choose redemption over control? Would Willow be able to maintain her dignity and protect her children in the face of such overwhelming adversity? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain, both of them would be forever changed by the choices they made in the coming days. The battle for their futures had just begun, and the cost of victory would be far higher than either of them had anticipated. In the end, Willow and Drew would come to a harsh and undeniable truth: life is not always something that can be controlled. The decisions they had made, the paths they had chosen, were not just fleeting moments but had set in motion a series of events that would determine the rest of their lives. For Willow, the reality of motherhood and protecting her children became intertwined with the painful acceptance that not every choice leads to the outcome she hoped for. As much as she had tried to control the situation, to manipulate the narrative for the sake of her family, the harsh truth was that Drew's betrayal, and the consequences of his actions, could not be undone. Drew, too, faced this realization as the weight of his manipulations and greed pressed down on him. His obsession with control, with gaining power, had alienated him from the one thing that could have given him true fulfillment: love and family. Now, both of them stood at the edge of a precipice, unable to return to the lives they once imagined, and unable to predict what would come next. The question that loomed over both of them was whether they could find a path to reconciliation, or whether they would remain trapped in a never-ending cycle of deception, hatred, and loss. Would Drew's obsession with power and his own guilt be the undoing of any chance of redemption, or could he find a way to break free from the chains of his past actions? And for Willow, could she forgive herself for trusting him and move forward, or would the scars of his betrayal keep her bound to the pain? They had both built their worlds on fragile foundations: Drew, on lies and manipulation; Willow, on love and hope for a family. Now, both had to face the crumbling reality of those illusions. Time would ultimately decide whether they could rebuild anything worthwhile from the ashes of their choices, or whether they would be doomed to repeat the cycle of destruction they had both created. The road ahead was uncertain, and the true cost of their decisions was yet to be fully revealed.